Chris, you are the ones that are suggesting these radical changes to the LRA. What do you have in mind?
I think I should just correct that for a moment. I'm not necessarily one of the people you're referring to who proposes radical changes to the LRA. But it seems to me to be very clear that we are facing a significant rupture in the collective bargaining system. We now have faced several months, a sustained period of large-scale industrial action that's taking place outside the parameters of the collective bargaining system that is set up in the Labour Relations Act. So people refer to it as unprotected or illegal strike action. And the knock-on consequences and the very, very serious adverse consequences for workers who are participating in that action, for the economy as a whole, it seems to me are extremely serious. I think there is unanimity about that. So for me, it's extremely important to ask the question, are our structures working? Are there changes that we need to make to the structure? And I suppose I'm one of those practitioners who says, unless we interrogate that question very deeply, then we are failing to tackle what might be the underlying causes of the current round.
Let's go back to your first point, though. This rupture in collective bargaining, how does it manifest itself for somebody who's probably just outside the environment? How does it manifest itself?
I suppose there's really two very serious problems. The one is the phenomenon which is evident in Marikana, it was at Implats before, throughout the mining industry now, of workers effectively turning their backs on their traditional organised representatives, their trade unions, and saying, we are embarking on industrial action. We don't care that it's unprotected action. We've got demands that are not being satisfied through the existing structure of collective bargaining. And so we are moving ahead. And that's the one main way in which it's manifesting itself. The second is the increasing levels of violence and unlawful criminal conduct associated with strike action. And that's been a phenomenon that's grown over the last 5 years very noticeably, perhaps longer. And strikes have very seldom in the history of South Africa or in any other democratic industrial environment been completely without any form of coercion or violence from time to time. But we've seen a very significant increase. And the question is, and in fact, I think COSATU's recent research candidly acknowledges that a majority of workers see some form of violence or coercion as an inherent part of a strike. And the question is, why is that? Why are workers not able to achieve the collective bargaining gains they're looking for? Why aren't they able to exert power within what we might describe as the accepted rules of the game that society has put in place? And at the moment, bargaining is happening outside the accepted rules of the game in at least those two respects.
There was a statement yesterday issued by the presidency after the meeting between business leaders, unions, and of course, government leaders. Part of the statement reads, and I'm going to read that section. It says, we are of the common view that our collective bargaining system is broadly sound, that the integrity of the system must be defended. The system should constantly ensure that it becomes more responsive to pressures and challenges in the labour market and the economy. Firstly, do you agree with the statement?
That's a yes and no answer that you're putting me to. I don't agree, but it may be that we need to put a bit more context in it. The collective bargaining system, everyone is referring to the principle that our constitution recognizes a right of all workers to engage in collective bargaining. Everybody, I think, agrees with that. Our Labour Relations Act seeks to give effect to that by setting up various collective bargaining structures, and we can debate the niceties of that. I personally don't think that's working at the moment. I don't think it means that we necessarily need radical reform. It's possible that if we changed our behavior and our use of the existing collective bargaining system, that we could see significant improvement. But I don't think that you can reach that conclusion. And of course, I wasn't at the meetings between the social partners, where the president says everyone reached that conclusion. But it seems to me a little premature.
So if you were in this meeting, you would not have agreed with this?
Well, I would have listened to what they say, but it seems to me to be premature and a little bit too soon to reach a conclusion that everything is okay. I think, and in fact, I've understood COSATU in recent papers that they've presented to the NEC and in other public forum to have mooted the idea of an expedited but very fundamental review of what is working and what is not working with our collective bargaining structures. And I think it's too early to conclude that all is well.
Prakashne Governor, then please come to, especially on this issue of the statement yesterday that seems to suggest that broadly everything is well.
I think the first thing we should probably do is avoid looking for a singular solution to what is a highly complex problem. Obviously, we would have to look at the bargaining structure and consider that. But the defense of the bargaining structure shouldn't be about defense of the bargaining structure as an end in itself. The bargaining structure is supposed to produce results that ultimately the parties to and whom the constituencies are representing, it should produce results and outcomes that they are happy with. Now, currently, the dynamics that we have across different sectors and industries, you've got huge rates, there's still poverty, wages, inequality. With atypical, irregular labor, you find there's inequalities across, amongst workers who are doing the same kind of work. The problem may not necessarily be purely in the legal provisions, but it may actually be in relation to the extent to which people have confidence in the results that are being produced, and I think we need to take that into account.
So you do agree then with Chris that it's premature to say that the system is stable and sound?
I think as a whole it's stable and sound, but there is room to consider a multi-tier or holistic solution, which means looking at the law, looking at the way in which parties approach collective bargaining in general. And on the question of violence, I think we also there's a very simplistic approach to violent protest action. And I want to emphasize protest action because it doesn't extend just to strikes. And I do want to also emphasize the majority of strike workers, despite what workers have expressed in the survey, the majority of workers who engage in strike action are non-violent in how they conduct themselves.
Yeah, but a sizable number of workers in your survey indicated that they think violence is the way to go, because they seem to suggest that when violence is involved, people tend to get what they want.
Yeah, there is a sizable who have expressed that view, but in the conduct of the action carried out. Let's take, for example, the protest march we had on labour brokers this year. It was a massive march around the country involving tens of thousands. So their views in terms of support of violence doesn't necessarily manifest itself in that manner, with the majority of workers actually being peaceful. I think there's a sizable number that we cannot ignore, and that is not something we should condone and support. But we shouldn't differentiate or separate this from general protest action, which you find is increasingly becoming violent across the country if you take into account service delivery protests, for example.
Yeah.
So if your response is to merely just condemn, we're not going to look to the root causes of what's causing this.
The reason why we get to violence is really just trying to understand whether or not the collective bargaining system is facing rupture, as Chris pointed out at the beginning. Do you agree with that sentiment, that there's quite a bit of rupture in the collective bargaining system at this time?
Well, I think we can, if we look at the Marikana incident, Marikana issue, the collective bargaining structure in the platinum industry doesn't have a centralized component, and the level of differentiation that happens creates a space for extreme unhappiness when there's inequalities. What has been mooted as part of the solution that we need to look at, and you could do that obviously with or without legislation, is look at a more centralized bargaining approach, which would not only increase equality when you're bargaining, obviously the outcome has to be one that's acceptable, but it would also address things where, for example, you've got atypical labor, where you've got labor that's been outsourced or subcontracted.
Let me bring in Mr. Mkhaliphi. Mr. Mkhaliphi, from where you are seated, is everything all right?
Well, from where I'm sitting as government is that we don't think that the system is broken down.
But why are you changing things such as allowing minority unions to participate then?
Let's just put the point over. Is that we engage in this country in collective bargaining over a number of different sectors. And the only sector that has got a problem is the mining sector. All other sectors, collective bargaining is continuing properly. There's no breakdown of the system. And the reason we're making the changes that we're making in the law is not because of the incident that has taken place now. We've made these changes, we've debated them with Labour and business at NEDLEC over 2 years. Unfortunately, there was no agreement by all parties on these issues, specifically business. We do believe that the law, especially around the areas of collective bargaining, we should do something to try and see whether can we take out the problems that are there.
All right, but let's take up, sorry to interrupt you, because I really need to take up some of the issues you're mentioning. You say the only sector is the mining sector. Actually, some people may say we saw the same thing with the truck drivers, where people were preferring to go directly to employers as opposed to using the bargaining structures that have been established. So it's not the only sector, but also 2 years ago, 3 years ago, people would have said, well, everything was good and well within the mining sector in terms of the bargaining system until Marikana and until Amplats happened. So that it hasn't happened in other sectors doesn't mean that it's all well and good.
The issue that I'm raising is that are there no other factors in the mining sector that causes this? The issue of poverty around the mining sector, the issue of service delivery generally, doesn't that affect it? That's the issue that nobody is dealing with. On the transport strike, there was no situation where workers wanted to go direct. What happened there is that there's a sector dealing with securing of finance that wanted to go direct as a sector, not individual companies wanting to go direct. They respected collective bargaining, and that situation took place with the unions themselves involved.
They didn't respect collective bargaining. There was violence.
The issues that you are raising, Tolani, are two issues. It's violence and the crippling of collective bargaining institutions. There is a problem with violence in our strikes. There's no doubt about that. It's for those reasons that in the network negotiations as government, we put proposals that we thought are going to assist in curbing violence in strike.
If I can just quickly respond to one other thing, I certainly am not saying that our collective bargaining system has broken down completely, but I think that something short of that still requires urgent attention and intervention. But I think one of the problems with what Prakashni is talking about, centralised bargaining, I think that the most careful or insightful in diagnoses I've seen so far of what's gone wrong in the mining sector is it discloses that there is a serious rift that has developed between shop floor workers and, in the case of the mining industry, coalface or rockface workers and the trade union movement that represents them. And I think COSATU have been candid about acknowledging this, but I think it's a very, very serious problem. Some people have called it the development of a union aristocracy or the bureaucratization of the major trade union movement, the COSATU unions in this industry. But what I'm very concerned about, and I think that it needs more careful thought, is that increasing centralization does not address that problem. In fact, focusing on industry bargaining does exactly the opposite. It inherently creates the aristocracy of trade unions who are dealing with industry-level bargaining issues at an industry level and takes them further and further from workers on the ground.
That's an interesting point because currently there are negotiations within the platinum sector to centralize negotiations a lot more, because people are saying that if, for instance, let's take examples of Marikana itself. People at Marikana get a different pay from people at Royal Bafokeng. But if you have some sort of an agreement, you don't have people saying that, but those people over there are getting 10 times more than we do here.
It may be so. I mean, there are obvious benefits of getting to standardize norms at an industry level. I mean, one can see that the stability that creates. But when our Labour Relations Act was enacted, what I understand the architects to have wanted to put in place was the notion of industry frameworks, where the industry would set perhaps norms and standards, minimum standards, or even actual standards in certain respects, but then devolve a significant amount of interaction to the workplace level, because one mine is not the same as another. And in fact, workers operating in one mine might, if they work cooperatively with management, be able to develop improvements in productivity and all sorts of things which actually allow them to develop better conditions both for workers and in the interests of the company.